Wife secretly checked her husband's phone and cried at what she found. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. The clock on our nightstand read 2:47 a.m. when I finally gave in to the gnawing anxiety that had been eating at me for weeks. David was sleeping peacefully beside me, his breathing steady and deep, completely unaware of the storm raging in my heart. His phone lay there on the nightstand, just inches away from my trembling fingers, its dark screen reflecting the pale moonlight filtering through our bedroom curtains. I had been married to David for 12 years. 12 beautiful, imperfect, wonderfully ordinary years, filled with shared laughter, quiet Sunday mornings, and the kind of comfortable silence that only comes when two people truly know each other. Or so I thought. But lately, something had changed. It started small, almost imperceptibly small. A glance away when his phone buzzed during dinner. A quick step into the hallway when it rang while we were watching television together. The way he would flip his phone face down on the counter when I entered the kitchen, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. David wasn't the type to hide things from me. He was honest to a fault, sometimes brutally so. When I'd gained weight after my mother's death 2 years ago, he'd gently suggested we start taking evening walks together. When I'd wanted to spend money we didn't have on redecorating the living room, he'd sat me down with our budget and shown me exactly why it wasn't feasible. David didn't lie. David didn't hide things. But as the days turned into weeks, the small signs multiplied like cracks in a windshield. He would disappear for hours on Saturday afternoons, claiming he was running errands that should have taken 30 minutes. He'd started working late more often, texting me brief explanations. Client meeting running over, or catching up on paperwork. When he came home, he seemed distracted, distant, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The worst part was how he'd started looking at me. There was something in his eyes, a sadness maybe, or was it guilt? When I'd catch him staring at me across the dinner table, he'd quickly look away and ask about my day. But there was a forced quality to his cheerfulness that made my stomach clench with dread. I tried to push the thoughts away. I threw myself into my work at the library, staying late to reorganize the children's section, anything to keep my mind occupied. I called my sister more often, seeking the comfort of familiar conversation. I even suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains, thinking that maybe some time away together would restore whatever we seemed to be losing. But David had declined the trip. Too much going on at work right now, he'd said, not meeting my eyes. Maybe in a few weeks? That was 3 weeks ago. Now, lying here in the darkness with his phone just within reach, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The woman I used to be would never consider doing what I was about to do. I had always prided myself on being the kind of wife who trusted completely, who believed in the sanctity of privacy even within marriage. I had friends who regularly checked their husbands' phones, who knew their passwords and monitored their social media accounts, and I had always felt slightly superior to them. Not me, I thought. David and I had something better than that. We had trust. But trust, I was learning, was a fragile thing. It could be eroded so gradually that you didn't notice it was gone until you found yourself lying awake at 2:47 a.m., staring at your husband's phone like it held all the answers to questions you were afraid to ask. My hand hovered over the device. David stirred slightly beside me, and I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. What if he woke up? What if he caught me? How would I explain this moment of weakness, this betrayal of everything we'd built together? But he didn't wake up. His breathing returned to its steady rhythm, and after what felt like an eternity, I carefully picked up his phone. The screen came to life, illuminating my face in the darkness, and I was grateful for the 100th time that David had never been the type to use complicated passwords. His phone was secured with a simple 4-digit code. Our wedding anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me. 10/25, October 25th, 2011. The day I had promised to love, honor, and trust him for better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. My finger hesitated over the final digit. I could still stop this. I could put the phone back, roll over, and try to go back to sleep. I could wake up in the morning and choose to trust my husband, to believe that whatever was going on was innocent, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But the doubt had taken root too deeply. I pressed the final number, and the phone unlocked with a soft chime. I held my breath, waiting to see if the sound had disturbed David, but he remained still. I quickly lowered the screen brightness and turned away from him, cocooning myself in the blue glow of betrayal. Where to start? Text messages seemed like the obvious choice. With shaking fingers, I opened his messaging app and began to scroll through his recent conversations. Work colleagues, his brother Mike, our mutual friend Tom, asking about plans for the upcoming football season. Everything looked perfectly normal, perfectly innocent. I scrolled further back, my eyes scanning every message for something, anything, that would explain the distance I'd been feeling. There were conversations I remembered. David telling me about his brother's new job, Tom's plans for a summer barbecue, and conversations I didn't. A brief exchange with someone named Sarah from his office about a project deadline. A longer conversation with his mother about his father's upcoming birthday. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that screamed infidelity or deception. But somehow, that almost made it worse. If there was nothing to hide, why had he been acting so strangely? I moved on to his call log. Again, everything seemed normal. Calls to and from work, family, friends. A few calls to numbers I didn't recognize. But when I looked them up, they appeared to be businesses. A home repair company, the auto shop where he'd had his oil changed last month. My anxiety was beginning to mix with confusion and a growing sense of foolishness. Maybe I really was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of my job, the anniversary of my mother's death approaching, maybe all of it was making me paranoid and suspicious where there was no reason to be. But then I noticed something strange in his photo gallery. David wasn't much of a photographer. His camera roll usually contained screenshots of articles he wanted to remember to read, pictures of receipts for tax purposes, the occasional photo of our cat doing something amusing. But recently, there had been more photos than usual. Much more. I opened the gallery and began scrolling through the recent images. Screenshots of medical websites, photos of what looked like appointment cards or medical documents, too blurry to read clearly in the dim light. And then, buried among them, a folder I'd never seen before, labeled simply M. My blood ran cold. M for what? Or who? Michelle? Margaret? Maria? With a trembling finger, I tapped on the folder. It contained dozens of photos, and as I began to scroll through them, my world tilted on its axis. These weren't photos of another woman. They were photos of David himself, but not like any photos I'd seen of him before. They were medical photos, pictures of what looked like x-rays, lab results, and medical reports. Some were too technical for me to understand, but others were clearer. Blood test results with numbers that meant nothing to me, but were highlighted in yellow. Images that looked like CT scans or MRIs. And then, near the bottom of the folder, a series of photos that made my heart stop completely. They were pictures of David's torso, his shirt lifted to reveal his chest and stomach, but scattered across his skin were marks I'd never seen before. Small, dark spots that looked like something was terribly, terribly wrong. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. My hands were shaking so violently now that I could barely hold the phone steady. What was I looking at? What were these marks? Why had David been taking pictures of his own body like this? And then, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, I understood. The distance. The secrecy. The sad way he'd been looking at me. The declined weekend trip. The phone calls he didn't want me to overhear. David was sick. David was very, very sick, and he hadn't told me. I scrolled through more photos with growing horror and heartbreak. There were pictures of medication bottles, their labels clearly showing David's name alongside drug names I didn't recognize. But that sounded serious, medical, frightening. There were photos of appointment cards for doctors I'd never heard him mention. Oncologists, specialists, people you only saw when something was very wrong. Near the end of the folder, I found a series of photos that made everything clear. They were pictures of paperwork, insurance documents, and medical reports. Though the photos were somewhat blurry, I could make out enough to understand what I was looking at. Test results, treatment plans, words that jumped out at me like physical blows. Malignant, stage, prognosis, treatment options. My husband had cancer, and he hadn't told me. I scrolled to the very last photo in the folder, and this time I couldn't stop the sob from escaping. It was a picture of a handwritten note, clearly in David's careful script. I had to zoom in to read it, and when I did, the words blurred through my tears. Things to remember for Emma. She hates when the dishes aren't rinsed before going in the dishwasher. Always buy the good coffee, not the store brand. Life's too short. Her favorite flowers are yellow daisies, not roses. Most guys get this wrong. She gets cold easily. Always keep extra blankets in the bedroom closet. She's stronger than she knows, but she'll need time to be angry first. Tell her the night we met at Tom's party, I knew I was going to marry her. The life insurance papers are in the filing cabinet under L. I loved her more than she'll ever know. The list continued, but I couldn't read any more. The phone slipped from my nerveless fingers and fell silently onto the comforter as I pressed both hands to my mouth, trying to muffle the sobs that were now coming in great, heaving waves. He was dying. My David, my steady, reliable, wonderful David was dying. And instead of leaning on me, instead of letting me share this burden with him, he was protecting me from it. He was facing the most terrifying experience of his life alone, all while creating lists and taking pictures to make sure I'd be okay after he was gone. I thought of all the times over the past few weeks when I'd felt irritated by his distraction, frustrated by his secrecy. I thought of the moments when I'd wondered if he still loved me, if he was growing tired of our marriage, if there was someone else who had captured his attention and his heart. And all the while, he was fighting for his life and trying to figure out how to tell me, how to break the news that would shatter both our worlds. The guilt was overwhelming. While he was sitting in doctors' offices receiving devastating news, I was at home wondering why he seemed distant. While he was researching treatment options and taking photos for his medical records, I was crafting scenarios of infidelity in my mind. While he was writing lists to help me navigate life without him, I was checking his phone behind his back, violating his privacy and our trust. I carefully picked up the phone and continued looking through his messages, but now with different eyes. Those conversations I'd seen earlier took on new meaning. The exchange with his mother about his father's birthday, I now noticed it included questions about family medical history. The calls to unknown numbers weren't to secret lovers, they were to medical offices and insurance companies. Even his conversation with Sarah from work, which had seemed so innocuous, now revealed itself to be about taking medical leave and transferring his projects to other colleagues. I found a text thread with his brother Mike that nearly broke my heart all over again. David: still haven't told her. I don't know how. Mike: you have to, man. She deserves to know. David: I know. I just need a little more time to figure out the best way. The results from yesterday weren't what we hoped for. Mike: what did Dr. Patterson say about treatment options? David: we're looking at surgery first, then chemo. It's going to be rough. I just want to give her a few more days of normal before everything changes. Mike: she's tougher than you think, and she loves you. You're not protecting her by keeping this secret. David: I know. You're right. I'm going to tell her this weekend. I just need to figure out the right words. The conversation was from 5 days ago, this weekend. He had been planning to tell me this weekend. I scrolled through more of their conversation, finding weeks' worth of messages that painted a picture of David's struggle. Not just with his illness, but with the burden of carrying this secret. Mike had been his confidant, helping him navigate the medical system, driving him to appointments when David was too weak or too shaken to drive himself. I found references to appointments I'd never known about, treatments that explained the days he'd seemed particularly exhausted, side effects that accounted for the subtle changes I'd noticed in his appearance and energy levels. In one particularly heartbreaking exchange, David had sent Mike a photo, one I recognized from the medical folder, of a treatment schedule. David: "Look at this timeline. 6 months of chemo, maybe more depending on how I respond. How do I ask her to go through this with me? How do I ask her to watch me get sicker before I get better, if I get better?" Mike: "You don't ask. You tell her what's happening, and you let her decide how she wants to be there for you. That's what marriage is, David. You made vows." David: "I remember the vows. In sickness and in health. I just never thought I'd be the sick one so soon. We're only 34, Mike. This wasn't supposed to happen yet." Mike: "It happened anyway, and Emma loves you. She's going to want to fight this with you, not find out about it after you've been fighting alone." I found myself crying again, but these were different tears. Not the tears of betrayal and suspicion I'd been preparing myself for, but tears of love and regret and overwhelming emotion. My husband wasn't pulling away from me because he loved me less. He was pulling away because he loved me so much that he wanted to spare me pain, even if it meant bearing an unbearable burden alone. I scrolled further back in his conversations and found something that made me gasp aloud. It was a long message thread with someone named Dr. Catherine Reynolds, and as I read through it, I realized David had been seeing a counselor, someone to help him process his diagnosis and figure out how to tell me. Dr. Reynolds: "How are you feeling about our plan to tell Emma this weekend?" David: "Terrified. What if she can't handle it? What if this breaks us?" Dr. Reynolds: "What if it makes you stronger? What if she surprises you with her resilience?" David: "She's already so strong. She held everything together when her mother died. I watched her be strong for everyone else, and now I'm supposed to ask her to be strong for me too?" Dr. Reynolds: "You're not asking her to be strong. You're giving her the chance to love you through the hardest thing you've ever faced. There's a difference." David: "I keep thinking about all the plans we made. The trip to Europe next year, buying a house, maybe starting a family. All of that might be off the table now." Dr. Reynolds: "Or it might not be. But either way, those decisions should be made together, with all the information. She can't make informed choices about your shared future if she doesn't know what you're facing." The conversation continued, but I had to stop reading. I was crying so hard now that I could barely see the screen, and I was terrified I would wake David. I carefully placed his phone back on the nightstand and curled up on my side, facing away from him, trying to muffle my sobs in my pillow. Everything made sense now. The secretive phone calls were conversations with doctors, insurance companies, his brother, his counselor. The distant looks were him trying to figure out how to protect me from devastating news while simultaneously trying to prepare for the fight of his life. The declined weekend trip wasn't because he was losing interest in our relationship. It was because he was probably feeling too sick from treatments I didn't even know he was receiving, or because he knew he'd have to tell me the truth during a romantic getaway and didn't want to taint those memories forever. And I had suspected him of infidelity. I had lain awake nights wondering if he was falling out of love with me, if there was another woman, if our marriage was falling apart. I had violated his privacy and his trust, sneaking through his phone like a jealous teenager instead of talking to him like the wife who had promised to be his partner through everything life threw at us. The shame was almost unbearable. While David was showing more love and protection for me than I'd ever thought possible, shielding me from his pain, trying to arrange his affairs so I'd be taken care of, creating detailed notes to help me navigate life without him, I was doubting his faithfulness and loyalty. He was proving himself to be the most devoted husband imaginable, and I was proving myself to be exactly the kind of wife who checks her husband's phone in the middle of the night. But alongside the shame came a fierce surge of love and determination. My husband was sick, maybe dying, and he was trying to face it alone. He was trying to protect me from the very thing that I most needed to know so I could protect him. We were both getting it wrong. He by hiding his illness, me by hiding my suspicions. And meanwhile, precious time was slipping away. I thought about the list he'd written, the one with reminders about yellow daisies and good coffee and extra blankets. The casual way he'd noted the location of the life insurance papers. The matter-of-fact planning for a future where I would have to navigate the world without him. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and completely, utterly like David to be so practical and thoughtful even in the face of his own mortality. But I didn't want his lists and his careful preparations. I didn't want to be protected from his illness or shielded from his pain. I wanted to be his partner, his teammate, his fellow warrior in whatever battle he was fighting. I wanted to sit with him in doctors' offices and research treatment options and hold his hand during chemotherapy. I wanted to be the person he turned to when he was scared, not the person he hid his fear from. I wanted to be his wife, not his widow-in-waiting. The clock now read 4:23 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, but I felt like I had lived several lifetimes in the past hour and a half. I had gone to sleep as a suspicious wife harboring doubts about her husband's faithfulness, and I was going to wake up as a woman whose husband was fighting for his life. The transformation felt surreal, like I had stepped through some kind of portal into an alternate version of my own life. I turned over carefully to look at David. In the dim light, I could see his face more clearly than I had in weeks. Now that I knew what to look for, I could see the subtle signs I'd missed before. He had lost weight, not much, but enough that his cheekbones were more prominent than they used to be. There were dark circles under his eyes that I'd attributed to work stress. His skin had a pallor that I'd somehow overlooked, too caught up in my own anxieties to notice that my husband was sick. How long had he been dealing with this alone? How many doctor's appointments had he attended by himself while I was at work, oblivious? How many nights had he lain awake beside me, terrified and trying to figure out how to tell me that our world was about to change forever? I reached out slowly and gently touched his face, being careful not to wake him. His skin was warm, alive, real. He was still here. Whatever we were facing it together, whether he wanted to protect me from it or not. I was going to make sure of that. As I lay there watching him sleep, I began to plan. I wasn't going to confront him with what I discovered in his phone. That would only add shame and guilt to the burden he was already carrying. Instead, I was going to give him the opening he needed to tell me himself. I would create a safe space for the conversation he'd been trying to have, make it easier for him to be honest with me. Maybe I'd suggest we take that weekend trip after all, but somewhere close to home, somewhere comfortable where difficult conversations felt possible. Or maybe I'd simply tell him I'd been feeling distant from him lately and ask if there was anything he needed to share with me, anything at all. I'd make it clear that there was nothing he could tell me that would make me love him less, nothing he was facing that we couldn't face better together. But most importantly, I was going to forgive myself for the doubt and suspicion of the past few weeks. I'd been wrong to check his phone, wrong to assume the worst, but I hadn't been wrong to sense that something had changed between us. Something had changed. David was carrying an enormous secret that was affecting every aspect of his life and our relationship. My instincts hadn't been off. I'd just misinterpreted what they were telling me. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when David's alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. I pretended to be asleep as he carefully slipped out of bed, but I watched through barely opened eyes as he moved around our bedroom, getting ready for what I now knew would be another day of carrying his secret alone. But not for much longer. When he leaned over to kiss my forehead goodbye, a ritual he'd maintained every morning for 12 years, I caught his hand and looked up at him. "I love you," I said, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. He smiled, but I could see the sadness in his eyes that I'd been too distracted to notice before. "I love you too, Em, more than you know." "Ah, I know," I said, squeezing his hand. And David, whatever you're going through, whatever you're worried about, we'll figure it out together, okay? You don't have to carry everything alone. His expression changed, surprise and relief, and something that might have been hope flickering across his features. This weekend, I said gently. Let's talk this weekend, whatever it is. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. This weekend, he agreed. After he left for work, I called in sick to the library. I had planning to do, preparations to make for the conversation that would change everything. But first, I sat in our quiet kitchen with a cup of the good coffee David always insisted we buy, and I cried. I cried for the weeks of suspicion and doubt. I cried for my husband facing his fear alone. I cried for the innocence we were about to lose, the simple happiness of not knowing how fragile life could be. But most of all, I cried with gratitude. Gratitude that David's secret wasn't betrayal, but protection. Gratitude that my marriage wasn't ending, but entering its most important chapter. Gratitude that I'd found out the truth in time to be the wife David needed, the partner he deserved. I thought about the other women I might have been, the wife who never found out until it was too late, or the wife who discovered infidelity instead of illness. I thought about how different this story could have been, how much worse the truth in David's phone could have been. Instead, I had discovered that my husband loved me so much he was trying to shield me from his pain. I had learned that his distance wasn't rejection, but protection. That his secrets weren't betrayal, but sacrifice. The truth hadn't destroyed my marriage. It had revealed just how strong it actually was. David would be home that evening, and when he walked through the door, he would see yellow daisies on the kitchen table and good coffee brewing. He would see his wife of 12 years ready to fight whatever battle lay ahead, ready to prove that the vows they'd made all those years ago weren't just pretty words, but a blueprint for exactly this kind of moment. In sickness and in health, we'd promised, for better or worse. We were about to find out just how much those words could hold, just how strong love could be when everything else fell away. And despite everything, the illness, the fear, the uncertain future, I had never felt more grateful to be David's wife, or more ready to show him what our marriage was really made of. The phone call I'd been dreading, the one where David would tell me about his diagnosis, was going to be the beginning of the most important conversation of our marriage. And I was ready for it. More than ready, I was grateful for it. Because the truth, even when it's terrifying, is always better than the alternative. And love, real love, isn't diminished by illness or strengthened by secrecy. It's proven in moments exactly like this one, when everything you thought you knew changes, and you discover that what you actually know, that you love this person, that you're committed to this life together, is all that really matters. David's secret had nearly torn us apart while he tried to hold us together. But now that I knew the truth, now that the burden of secrecy was about to be lifted, I could see clearly what I'd forgotten in my weeks of doubt and suspicion. We were partners, teammates, two people who had chosen each other for exactly these moments when choosing each other would be the hardest and most important thing we'd ever do. I finished my coffee and began planning the conversation that would save our marriage by finally, honestly, facing everything we were too frightened to say out loud. It was going to be the hardest conversation of our lives, but it was also going to be the one that proved what we were really made of, and I couldn't wait to have it.